The 1970s were an era of bold experimentation in home cooking, sometimes delicious, sometimes downright baffling. In the following discussion, we'll explore 8 zany dinner ideas that once seemed destined for fame, only to end up relics of a bygone culinary age. Prepare for a nostalgic dive into strange ingredients, surprising shortcuts, and dishes that captured the spirit of a changing nation. Number 1. The Swedish meatballs in grape jelly mystery. Throughout the 1970s, party tables and family dinners across the United States saw an oddly compelling dish that combined Swedish meatballs with a sauce made from grape jelly and chili sauce. Many people trace its origin further back, possibly to the 1950s, when processed convenience foods and novel recipe ideas first gained traction. But by the 1970s, cookbooks, cooking shows, and old commercials were pushing the idea that these sticky sweet spheres made any gathering more festive. Baby boomers remember how their parents would carefully craft the meatballs from ground beef or a blend of beef and pork, then simmer them in a slow cooker filled with grape jelly, chili sauce, and sometimes a splash of Worcestershire or soy sauce for a gourmet twist. The appeal lay in how quick and cost-effective the recipe was, often using only a few store-bought ingredients. Analyzing interviews and forums dedicated to American nostalgia reveals that this dish found its way into everything from suburban house parties to potlucks at church basements. It tied neatly into the 1970s convenience culture, where feeding a crowd with minimal effort reigned supreme. Old Hollywood stars occasionally appeared in newspaper ads, touting surprising pairings like fruit jellies with savory sauces, adding a dash of glamour to what was essentially a budget meal. Gen Xers who grew up sampling these meatballs often described them with fondness, recalling how the sticky sauce would cling to toothpicks and stain the napkins a deep purple hue. But as tastes evolved, the novelty of mixing grape jelly with meatballs began to wear off. Many younger cooks discovered more traditional Swedish meatball recipes that feature cream sauces or rich beef gravies, leading to a decline in the jelly-based variety. Additionally, health-conscious trends of the 1980s and beyond discouraged the use of sugary condiments with processed meats. Over time, the grape jelly version retreated into the realm of quirky potluck history. Today, it occasionally resurfaces as a retro party throwback, but for the most part, the world forgot about these candy-coated meat orbs once other international influences and fresher, less sugary flavors took center stage in American kitchens. Number 2. Salisbury steak with instant gravy. The concept of Salisbury steak dates all the way back to the 19th century, originally promoted by Dr. James Salisbury as a healthful way to consume beef. By the mid-20th century, it evolved into a staple comfort food, frequently served in diners and, later, frozen TV dinners. However, the 1970s saw an explosion of Salisbury steak recipes using ready-made seasoning packets, instant gravy mixes, and sometimes bizarre fillers. Old commercials from that era showed housewives proudly stirring a packet of brown gravy powder into boiling water, then smothering a ground beef patty that might have been bulked up with breadcrumbs or cereal flakes. Baby boomers recall how their parents often turned to these packets for convenience, especially in two-income households where time was short. Digging through vintage cookbooks, you'll find endless variations of Salisbury steak that looked similar on the plate, a brownish patty drowning in a pool of glossy, dark sauce. The appeal hinged on the idea that you could replicate a diner or steakhouse experience at home without fussing over fresh herbs, real stock, or long hours at the stove. Gen X children sometimes remember these meals fondly for their straightforward flavors, often paired with instant mashed potatoes and canned green beans. The 1970s marked a golden age for processed convenience, so there was little worry about the high sodium or artificial additives lurking in gravy mixes. By the 1980s, awareness of diet-related health issues increased, and many families began reading ingredient labels more carefully. Some saw that these instant gravies were loaded with preservatives and excessive sodium. Coupled with a surge in interest for more global and diverse cuisines, Salisbury steak slipped behind the curtain of old America's cooking repertoire. Major brands tried to reinvent it with light or low-sodium versions in microwavable trays, but the dish's reputation for blandness and overprocessing persisted. Modern foodies who appreciate fresh ingredients and bold seasonings rarely look back on the instant gravy Salisbury steak with longing, leaving it mostly as a nostalgic memory in the family photo album of dinner lore. Number 3. Chicken Kiev with shortcut fillings. Traditional chicken Kiev is a Ukrainian-inspired dish that features a chicken breast wrapped around herb butter, then breaded and fried. Older cookbooks, even from the 1930s and 1940s, contained variations of the recipe, but it became a culinary craze in America during the 1960s and 1970s, especially when French-influenced cooking was all the rage on TV programs. Hostesses eager to impress would serve chicken Kiev at dinner parties, creating a sense of sophistication. By the 1970s, packaged herb butter or seasoned margarine hit supermarket shelves, promising to cut down on the preparation time. Many baby boomers also remember commercials where smiling chefs demonstrated how to pound the chicken flat and roll it up, though in reality, the process was often messy and time-consuming. Research into vintage advertisements shows that companies marketed shortcuts like pre-flavored butter inserts, claiming that anyone could whip up restaurant-quality chicken Kiev in half the time. Gen X kids sometimes recall opening the freezer to find boxes of individually pre-stuffed chicken breasts that only needed to be baked. The golden age shine of chicken Kiev was undeniable, especially when people sliced into that crispy exterior to watch a stream of herb-infused butter flow out. However, the filling could also leak prematurely if the chicken wasn't sealed well, leaving a soggy texture that disappointed guests. As dining habits shifted later in the 1970s and 1980s, home cooks drifted away from heavy breading and saturated butter sauces. The rise of lighter, fresher dishes made chicken Kiev feel indulgent and outdated, especially when concerns about saturated fat took center stage. By the 1990s, fewer dinner tables featured this once glamorous entree. Modern chefs might still offer refined versions in upscale restaurants, but for everyday Americans, the convenience-based shortcut chicken Kiev of the 1970s fell into obscurity, overshadowed by simpler chicken recipes that aligned better with new health and flavor preferences. Number 4. Glorified rice with maraschino cherries. Glorified rice has roots in earlier 20th century Americana, but the 1970s took it to new levels of decorative flair. At its core, this dessert-like dish combined cooked white rice, crushed pineapple, whipped topping, and sugar, then was often garnished with colorful maraschino cherries. Some versions even threw in miniature marshmallows for extra sweetness. Looking at old recipe cards from the 1930s to the 1950s, one sees a humble variation served in small bowls. Yet in the 1960s and 1970s, as parties became flashier and portion sizes grew, glorified rice often arrived at potlucks in large glass bowls, layered to show off its pastel color scheme. Nostalgia threads online show that baby boomers recall this concoction emerging primarily around holidays or family reunions. It was deemed both a side dish and a dessert, depending on the context. Advertisements in women's magazines of the 70s encouraged home cooks to use canned fruit, store-bought whipped topping, and instant rice to reduce preparation time. The perceived elegance came from how the white rice contrasted against bright cherries and yellow pineapple, echoing the flamboyant presentation style of old Hollywood banquets. Gen Xers might remember picking out the cherries or being startled by the sweet, chewy texture when they expected something savory. While children often enjoyed the sugary overload, adults sometimes found the starchy-sweet combination strange. As the late 1970s and early 1980s arrived, fresh fruit salads and lighter dessert options began replacing these sugary, processed combinations. Debates over the nutritional value of refined carbs and the artificial dyes in maraschino cherries prompted some families to abandon the dish altogether. Culinary fads then shifted toward global flavors, or at least simpler American recipes that didn't rely on as many processed items. Over time, glorified rice slipped off most dinner menus, surviving only in pockets of the Midwest or among families who cherished it as a sentimental relic. In the broader US, however, it joined the list of lost 1970s dishes that modern palates see as too sweet, too dated, and ultimately forgettable. Number 5. The Baked Alaska Showstopper. Baked Alaska's origins stretch further back than the 70s. Some say it dates to the 19th century, but it earned renewed attention in the post-World War II era, culminating in a flamboyant revival during the 1960s and 1970s. Despite being more of a dessert than a main course, Baked Alaska often became the crowning glory of a dinner party, so it's worth mentioning among the era's once trendy showstoppers that people mostly left behind. Combining sponge cake, ice cream, and meringue, this treat demanded a precise balance of temperatures. Baby boomers learned from cooking shows how to freeze the cake and ice cream rock solid, then quickly smother it in a thick layer of meringue, popping it into a hot oven just long enough to brown the exterior. In the 70s, certain restaurants even made a spectacle of flaming the baked Alaska tableside, reflecting a taste for drama that characterized the golden age of fine dining. Hostesses at home sometimes tried to emulate that flair, occasionally resulting in singed meringue or partial meltdowns. Archival advertisements from the 1970s show brand name ice creams being promoted as perfect for baked Alaska, saving you the trouble of rolling your own flavored layers. And old commercials portrayed families marveling at the improbable interplay of hot and cold in each spoonful. But as America entered the 1980s, the desire for simpler desserts grew. Homemade brownies or fruit-based pastries felt more attainable and required fewer steps. People also grew more calorie-conscious, and a dessert composed of cake, ice cream, and sugary meringue seemed too indulgent. Baked Alaska's showy presentation became a relic of earlier decades, symbolizing an era of elaborate dinner parties and theatrical cooking demonstrations. Modern bakeries and upscale restaurants might still break it out for nostalgia's sake, but everyday home kitchens tend to skip the fuss and unpredictability. As a result, Baked Alaska quietly slid into the annals of fancy but forgotten 1970s fare, overshadowed by the expanding range of international sweets and healthier dessert trends. Number 6. The Deviled Ham Cream Cheese Ball. Cheese balls of all sorts decorated holiday tables and casual get-togethers during the 1970s. They emerged from a broader mid-20th century trend where molded foods and dips reigned supreme. One particularly memorable variety featured deviled ham, often from a tiny, iconic can, mixed with cream cheese, spices, and sometimes minced onions or bell peppers. Then, the entire sphere was rolled in chopped nuts or parsley for a bit of crunch. The result was a pinkish interior once you sliced into it, a somewhat off-putting color for those not already used to deviled ham. Interviews with baby boomers highlight how essential the cheese ball was to social gatherings, where they might have placed it next to crackers, chips, or veggie sticks. Old commercials from the 1960s and 1970s boasted that deviled ham added a zesty kick to ordinary cheese spreads, encouraging hostesses to stray from the usual cheddar-based dips. The convenience factor was huge. No cooking, just mixing and shaping. Gen Xers might recall sneaking bites off the cheese ball during holiday parties, intrigued yet also uncertain about the strong ham flavor masked by tangy cream cheese. Scanning vintage recipe collections reveals that recipes often recommended a dash of Worcestershire sauce or even a packet of ranch seasoning for extra flavor, pushing the sodium and artificial additives up another notch. Like many 1970s party foods, the deviled ham cheese ball eventually fell from grace as diets changed and as fresh charcuterie boards with premium cheeses took center stage in American entertaining. People grew wary of processed meat in general, and the pink tinge became more suspect in an era that began to emphasize natural colors and quality ingredients. By the 1980s and 1990s, you'd see more imported cheeses, fancy crackers, and fruit spreads at parties, leaving the deviled ham cheese ball behind in the realm of kitschy nostalgia. While it still surfaces occasionally among retro enthusiasts who relish vintage potluck recipes, it's no longer a mainstream appetizer. Most modern hosts prefer simpler, fresher spreads or artisanal cheese plates that don't rely on mystery meat ingredients. Number 7. Hot fruit compote main dish mashups. In the 1970s, fruit compotes, traditionally a mix of warm fruits, sugar, and spices, were sometimes repurposed into main course dishes in surprising ways. Cooks exploring battered women's magazines or local community cookbooks from that era might find recipes calling for a can of pie filling added to pork chops or a heavy dose of stewed fruit slathered over chicken breasts. These suggestions aim to transform standard meats into something sweet, savory, and impressively complex, a reflection of how American households were dabbling in flavor fusions before truly understanding them. Baby boomers saw these recipes championed at potluck gatherings, especially around the holidays, when the idea of serving turkey or ham with a fruit glaze felt reminiscent of older times. While certain combinations turned out fine, like cranberries with turkey, others verged on the absurd. Online nostalgia groups reminisce about pork chops baked with peaches and syrup, or chicken thighs slow-cooked under an avalanche of sweet apples and raisins. Gen Xers who recall these dinners describe them as cloying, with the natural flavor of the meat drowned out by sugary fruit sauces. The 1970s reliance on canned products and high fructose syrups also meant the sweetness could be overpowering. Old commercials from big-name brands pushed these shortcuts, illustrating busy moms adding a single can of fruit filling to their meats as a quick trick to produce gourmet flair. As the 1980s arrived, more authentic ethnic cuisines introduced Americans to balanced sweet and savory dishes, revealing that there's a subtlety to combining fruit and meat that goes beyond dumping a can of pie filling into the pot. The resulting shift towards nuanced flavor profiles turned the 70s compote-based meals into relics. Overly sweet main dishes no longer fit modern cooking trends that favored fresh herbs, moderate sweetness, and a more careful interplay of ingredients. The old hot fruit compote dinners became a textbook example of how the convenience craze in that era sometimes ran amok, prompting a collective retreat from the sugary sauced meats that once graced the dinner tables of baby boomer families. Number 8. Stuffed shells with cottage cheese and mystery sauces. Stuffed pasta dishes have been around for centuries, often tied to Italian-American traditions that flourished in the early 20th century. By the 1970s, giant pasta shells filled with cottage cheese, or even cream cheese, rose in popularity among Americans who wanted something special but didn't want to fuss with layering a whole lasagna. Cookbooks from the 60s and 70s suggested dumping in any sort of sauce you had on hand. Sometimes a jar of tomato sauce, sometimes a can of condensed soup, or even a mixture of the two if you felt adventurous. Baby boomers remember that this dish seemed elevated enough for a dinner party, but still easy enough to whip up on a weeknight. Glancing at old commercials and print ads, it's clear that companies selling dairy products and canned sauces promoted stuffed shells as an innovative twist on classic Italian meals, implying a sense of old Hollywood glamour attached to any dish labeled Italian. Gen Xers might recall helping their parents mix cottage cheese with dried herbs and a beaten egg, then spooning the gooey mixture into each shell before drowning them in sauce and cheese. While the end result could be comforting, the frequent use of lower-quality tomato sauces or condensed soups sometimes produced a salty, overly thick coating. The turning point came when Americans gained a broader appreciation for authentic Italian cuisine in the 80s and 90s, especially as more authentic ingredients and cooking techniques became widely available. People discovered ricotta or fresh mozzarella and even learned to make homemade marinara with fresh tomatoes, basil, and garlic. The 1970s version, dependent on cottage cheese and random canned sauces, started to feel inauthentic and heavy. Modern home cooks looking for genuine flavors or healthier options saw little appeal in these shell dishes loaded with processed cheese and canned soup. As a result, that style of stuffed shells receded into the background, overshadowed by the myriad of exciting international recipes that poured into American kitchens. A few households might still cling to nostalgic family recipes, but the rest of the country largely forgot about these bizarrely flexible stuffed shells, preferring more refined techniques that give a nod to real Italian cooking. Those are 8 dinners that captured the spirit of 1970s American cooking experimentation, often blending convenience foods, sweet and savory combos, and a heavy reliance on processed ingredients. These culinary relics brought color, novelty, and a sense of adventure to the dinner table, fueled by old commercials, cooking show segments, and recipe pamphlets. However, changing health trends, evolving palates, and an influx of global cuisines gradually pushed them out of the mainstream. Today, they live on in memories and retro recipe collections, quietly reminding us that the golden age of convenience wasn't always as glamorous or as tasty as those glossy vintage photos might have suggested.